This is a story of how skateboarding, a hobby built on nothing more than a plank of wood and 4 wheels, got turned into a public menace, chased off sidewalks by local ordinances, demonized in the press, and treated less like a sport and more like a threat to public safety. By the mid-1970s, skateboarding was exploding in popularity, fueled by the invention of the urethane wheel and a booming skatepark industry. But rapid growth came with a real cost. Emergency rooms across the country began seeing a sharp rise in skateboarding-related injuries, from broken wrists to serious head trauma. This wasn't manufactured hysteria. The injury numbers were genuinely alarming, and they gave local governments and media outlets a legitimate starting point for a much larger crackdown that would follow. What happened next, though, went well beyond reasonable safety concern. The response to those injury statistics escalated quickly into a broader campaign that treated skateboarders themselves as the problem, not just the activity's inherent risk. Local news coverage throughout the mid to late 1970s played an outsized role in shaping public perception of skateboarding, and not in skating's favor. Reports frequently focused on worst-case scenarios, dramatic injury footage, alarmed parents, and quotes from officials warning about an out-of-control youth activity. Skateboarders were rarely presented as athletes practicing a skill. They were framed as reckless kids endangering themselves and the public, riding wherever they pleased with no regard for consequences. This media framing mattered enormously because most Americans who weren't skaters formed their entire understanding of the activity through exactly this kind of coverage. A relatively small number of dramatic incidents, amplified repeatedly across local news broadcasts, created a public perception wildly disproportionate to the actual scale of the problem. Skateboarding wasn't just seen as risky, it was increasingly framed as a symptom of teenage disorder, a symbol of kids who couldn't be controlled. As public concern grew, city governments across the country responded with a wave of local ordinances restricting or outright banning skateboarding on public property. Sidewalks, streets, plazas, and parking lots, spaces skaters had always used simply because there was nowhere else to go, suddenly became legally off limits in many towns and cities. Some places imposed fines. Others authorized police to confiscate skateboards on site, treating the activity itself, not any specific reckless behavior, as sufficient grounds for enforcement. This wave of local bans put skaters in an impossible position. They were being pushed off public spaces at the exact moment that private skate parks, the one legitimate alternative, were also becoming financially unsustainable, caught in a spiral of rising insurance costs driven by liability lawsuits over park injuries. Skaters were, in a very real sense, being squeezed out of both public and private space at the same time. The insurance crisis deserves its own explanation because it made the situation far worse than local ordinances alone. As skateboarding-related injuries increased, insurance companies serving the skate park industry raised premiums dramatically and in many cases refused to offer coverage at all. Skate parks that had been booming businesses just a year or two earlier found themselves financially unable to operate, and closures swept the country throughout the late 1970s. This created a devastating 1-2 punch. Cities were restricting skateboarding in public space through legal ordinances, while the private skate park industry, which could have absorbed displaced skaters, was simultaneously collapsing under its own liability crisis. Skaters, especially teenagers with limited resources or political voice, had almost nowhere left to legally practice the sport they loved. What's striking about this period, looking back, is how thoroughly skateboarding was framed as a public order issue rather than an athletic pursuit. City council meetings debated skateboarding alongside genuine public safety concerns, treating teenagers on boards as roughly equivalent to loitering or vandalism. Police departments in many cities got explicit authority to confiscate equipment and issue citations, a level of enforcement rarely applied to other youth recreational activities of the era. This framing had lasting cultural consequences. An entire generation of skaters grew up understanding correctly that mainstream society viewed their sport as illegitimate at best and criminal at worst. That experience of being legislated against, chased off sidewalks, and treated as inherently suspicious became deeply woven into skateboarding's identity, feeding directly into the anti-establishment, rebellious attitude that would come to define skate culture through the 1980s and beyond. The local bans and closures of the late 1970s didn't kill skateboarding, but they permanently reshaped it. Denied legal access to skate parks and public spaces, skaters adapted by moving into street skating, treating curbs, stairs, and parking blocks, spaces that existed in a legal gray area, as their new terrain. In an odd way, the very crackdown meant to suppress skateboarding helped push it toward the street skating revolution that would define the sport's next major era. The years of local bans also left skateboarding with a lasting wariness toward institutional authority that persists in the culture today. Decades after most of those specific ordinances were repealed or quietly stopped being enforced, skateboarding still carries a cultural memory of having been treated as a criminal nuisance rather than a legitimate sport, a memory that shaped everything from its media to its music to its enduring outsider identity. Skateboarding's crackdown in the 1970s wasn't the result of a single federal law or a coordinated national campaign. It was something more diffuse and in some ways more damaging. A patchwork of local ordinances, media-driven public panic, and an insurance crisis that together squeezed skaters out of nearly every legal space they had. The sport survived by adapting, moving to the streets, building its own underground media, and embracing the outsider status that had been forced onto it. What began as a genuine public safety concern turned into a broader campaign that treated an entire generation of skaters as a problem to be managed rather than a community to be supported, and skate culture has carried that memory and that defiance ever since.